Timmy Holley, it's a pleasure to get you on episode number 15, right? 15 of the Path to Follow podcast.
Honored to be here, Jake. Thanks for asking. I've seen the previous one, so they're very, very good, and you're very, very good with them. So I hope I can live up to the previous guests, but I've enjoyed watching them. So thanks for doing it. It's a great way to kind of have people see what's going on inside of Gilman. So
appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's great to get you here, and I'm looking forward to talking about your story and Gilman and everything that this place means to you. I know you're a lifetime Gilman Greyhound, so.
Well, and for those who know me, talking's not a problem, so I'm sure I'll have plenty to say. I'll try to stay on task and focused, but I'm happy to chat about my time here. It's been a very blessed journey for me. So.
Yeah, it's an amazing place. How about, so to start off, how did you first hear about Gilman?
Well, like most little kids, I hadn't heard of Gilman. I grew up in Northwest Baltimore, so if you take Northern Parkway and head west from Gilman, it dead ends into Liberty Road in the county, or Liberty Heights in the city. I was on the city side, so that's the neighborhood where I grew up. So the kids in that neighborhood generally were going to either Northwestern Senior High, which was one of the local public schools for high school, or Forest Park Senior High, which was the other, kind of in a different area. My mom was a teacher at Northwestern, and my parents are both teachers, so I get it honestly. They were both Baltimore City public school teachers at the time. And I'm the oldest of three boys, and they sent me to private school, which, you know, probably for them was a pretty conscious decision since they were public school teachers to do that. And so I went to a school that unfortunately closed its doors this past summer in June, Grace and St. Peter's, which is downtown on Park Avenue. So I went there for elementary school, and actually had gone to a private nursery school called the Little School ahead of that. But went to Grace and St. Peter's from 1st through 6th grade, graduated in 6th grade. In those days in Baltimore, people went to elementary school, then junior high. Junior high was 7, 8, 9, and then you went to high school in 10th grade. But the private schools were a little different in that you kind of went to middle school and then started high school in the 9th grade. So the natural entry point in those days for a place like Gilman was the 7th grade. So when I graduated from Grace St. Peter's, my parents told me I was going to private school again. My friends in the neighborhood were going to the local public schools, and I thought I wanted to kind of follow them. And they said, no, you're going to either Gilman or St. Paul's. And so I took the test at both places, was fortunate enough to get into both places. And my father, in particular, I think, had the notion that Gilman was the best school in town for a boy. And so while St. Paul's is a wonderful school, and I'm sure would have been fine, you know, I was kind of told you're going to Gilman. And I had no problem with that. In those days, you took the test and you kind of took your tour and you interviewed, and I immediately liked Gilman. Campus is beautiful, and lots of fields. I kind of consider myself to be somewhat athletic, so that seemed to be something that might appeal to me. And so I came here in the 7th grade. In those days, the 7th grade was a part of the upper school. So there was no middle school when I arrived at Gilman. You actually were in the lower school, which in those days was called first form through sixth form for the lower school. And then you came to the upper school, first form through sixth form. So first form was the 7th grade. So I was a first former. And then my class is the only class at Gilman to have been upper schoolers in the first form. And then Gilman built, not the current building, but they built a middle school separately for middle school age kids. And so we became 8th graders in the new middle school. And then we graduated from the 8th grade and then came back to the upper school.
Oh, wow.
As
so you
third formers or 9th graders.
So you were in the upper school and then you went to the new building.
Correct.
And then you're back.
Right. So I went upper, then to middle, then back to upper.
Okay.
And so my class did that, and we were the only class to do that because the following year, the class behind us, you know, they were middle schoolers and had not ever been in the upper school. So, which was a kind of the way the building was constructed in those days. The first and second form room is now where college counseling is. So we were in that room, and then when we came back to the upper school, we moved up a level to Centennial Hall, which was then called A Study Hall. That's where the 9th and 10th graders hung out. So we kind of felt like big men because we moved upstairs, and we were real upper school kids
Moving
then.
up.
And so that's how I got here.
Excellent. What was Gilman like in terms of just their reputation athletically and academically when you first came in? What was kind of your perception of Gilman as a first form, like a 7th and 8th grader?
Well, Gilman had a great reputation, and certainly had a reputation for scholarship and athleticism. And actually, in those days, where we're very strong now in the fine arts and theater arts, we were not. That was not one of Gilman had it, but it wasn't seen as a place where that was going to be as much of a focus as the academic and athletic parts of the curriculum. So, Gilman, as I mentioned earlier, the perception was if you were a boy and you could get into Gilman, and that was certainly the perception at Gracie St. Peter's when I was there. Every boy in my class tried to get into Gilman. That was the place to be. Mm-hmm. And so I actually had a little bit of a notion to go to McDonough because McDonough was military in those mm-hmm. days, and I kind of had a desire to kind of want to wear that uniform and be in the military. But I think for my parents, and I don't even know if McDonough did busing in those days. I had a cousin who had gone to McDonough. He's a little younger. I think it just wasn't as convenient to go out there. And again, Gilman was perceived to be the place, academically and athletically for a boy. So I think that was definitely, that reputation of Gilman certainly got to my parents, who, as Baltimore City school teachers, knew the public school scene very well. Mm-hmm. It was also a time when a lot of public school teachers, African-American teachers, were starting to send kids to some of the private schools. It was relatively new. And so, my parents had friends who had sent their kids to private school, and they kind of asked around. And neither one of them are from Baltimore. My father is from New Jersey. And went to Morgan State as a student athlete. He was a football track guy. And so he settled here after college and worked here. My mom she's from Kansas City, Missouri, and spent time as a kid in Kansas City and in Louisiana, which is where all of her family is. She and my dad met in graduate school. They both went to Columbia, and so they met there, and they settled here because my dad had a job here, and then she subsequently got a job here. So they weren't Baltimore people, so they didn't really know the landscape as much as a person who might have grown up here. And so they did their homework, and Gilman's reputation was tremendous. And so, I was the oldest one, and sometimes with the oldest one, you put all your eggs in that basket and mm-hmm. hope it works out, and then you hope the other ones follow. And I have two brothers. My middle brother actually went to Northwestern, where my mom taught, and my baby brother came to Gilman. I was here for 6 years. My baby brother was, in those days, a 12-year man, which was as long as you could be here.
He was a lifer.
He was a lifer. He was first through 12 years. So, and we're 8 years apart. So he actually, by the time he kind of got to the middle school, I was gone. I graduated, I think he was in the 4th grade. So, he didn't have to kind of mess around with following around behind me. He had his own way because of the age difference. So
when you came to Gilman, you were a stud athlete. What sports so you just grew up playing sports, loved sports, and you came to Gilman and that love for athletics was enhanced?
Well, I appreciate your description. I would I'm not sure I would describe it that way. Certainly when I came to Gilman, I was a 7th grader. So and probably in terms of physique, was a kind of little chubby kind of kid. Actually, one of my nicknames as a kid was Pot, and that's not a reference to the drug. That's a reference to hippopotamus, because I was of a fat kid. So
we all have our chubby stage,
right? And I certainly had mine. And so I don't think. I was interested in athletics because my dad had been I'm very blessed to have both my parents still with me. My dad will be 89 next month. My mom will be 86 in January. So that's a great blessing. But my father was, phys ed teacher and had been a college athlete, as I mentioned before. And so, with 3 boys, there was no question that we were all going to be into athletics. So by the time I got to Gilman, I had played Little League baseball. I played in Edmondson Village Little League, which was a neighborhood in town. And I actually played on Gilman's campus. It doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't existed for a long time, but I played Roland Park Little League football, which was right out here on our fields when I was an elementary school kid. So, I played a lot of basketball in the neighborhood. The basketball wasn't as organized in those days as football and baseball was. I mean, this was way before AAU, or even for some of the old people who might be watching, before BNBL. I mean, you kind of played in your neighborhood. That was kind of what you did in basketball. So, but I played all three of those, or tried to. And so when I got to Gilman, in the middle school, you kind of went through a sequence. It was like a physical education curriculum. You went through a sequence of different sports, and you kind of learned different sports. And, I had the three I already played, but got exposed to others, and decided to stick with the three I knew. And those were the ones that I kind of played in high school, and tried to do well.
Yeah. I think those sports, when you're playing in your backyard and, just messing around, maybe not so much organized like it is today with AAU and all the kind of pressure to, you fall in love with sports in your backyard. And that's how I started to love lacrosse, was just messing around in my backyard and playing with my dad and playing with my friends. Played basketball growing up, and like the pickup basketball and, two-hand touch football and that kind of thing. I mean, maybe that's when you decided maybe I want to play these a little bit more seriously in high school.
Well, in those days, I don't think you thought about the future in that way.
Yeah.
It wasn't as organized as it is today. I remember reading an article about the first guys who played Little League baseball, now they have the Little League World Series and it's on TV and all that. But the first guys who played, they just were a group of guys who went out and played, and they interviewed one of the guys who talked about the parents coming to the game. And he said, it never dawned on us that our parents would want to come and watch us play, right? It was a different time. By the time I came along, it was still a lot of kid organized stuff in the neighborhood. I mean, and you played not only the formal games of baseball, football, basketball, but you made up games. Mm-hmm. I mean, we didn't have computers. And by the way, on television, there were only 3 stations. So, you didn't have the electronics to distract you. I mean, everybody wanted to get out of the house and go in the neighborhood and play. And, if you're probably a New York kid, you played stickball. In Baltimore, we called it speedball. And, you played with a tennis ball, and sometimes when you were younger, you played with a broom handle. But I had the great fortune, and I think it kind of made me a little popular in the neighborhood because my dad was a phys ed teacher. He had a lot of equipment. So we had, real balls and bats and gloves and that kind of stuff because of his job. And so we played, literally, particularly in the summer, you'd play all day. I mean, you'd get up and, you'd be outside 8 a.m. and you'd play. Maybe you came home to eat. Probably your parents made you do that, and you'd play into dark. And so that was kind of the world in my neighborhood in which I was kind of thriving or developing. And so coming to Gilman and playing was natural because we played. But again, I think kids today and parents today look at that process as a means to other things. It never really crossed my mind when I came to Gilman that I was coming to be, a varsity athlete. It was just, you got old enough, and so you played on a team that was available, when you're a junior or a senior, because in those days, it was very unusual for a freshman or even a sophomore to make the varsity. I mean, you kind of played on the team you played on, you played. Mm-hmm. And if you happen to get a chance to play in college, great. But that was not kind of the thinking in those days. Just kind of played in the moment because
you love the sport.
Yeah, and players play. I mean, you just kind of played and enjoyed it and tried to compete and try to have fun at it. I think one of my and watching it kind of develop over the last 50 years since I came to Gilman, but trying to watch how this has developed. I really think sometimes today kids, and this is just the way things are. I'm making a judgment. I mean, kids work at it now. I think guys my age, we played. Right. And I think the work part of it has shifted the focus. I mean, it was unheard of for us to, in my day, to have, any personal trainers or skills coaches. I mean, generally, if you played Little League something, the dads were the coaches. And even, I had wonderful coaches at Gilman, but, they were teachers who coached because they enjoyed sports. I think the expertise level of coaches today is higher. Because they're more focused on that as an occupation. Mm-hmm. And certainly the focus for athletes is more intense. Now, I think they're bigger, stronger, and faster today because of that. Are they better? Well, I leave that to people with more expertise than I have. I think that they certainly are more refined in their skills.
Yep.
But I would say that maybe older players, guys from my era and earlier, probably were a little more students of the game. and it was less about the physicality and more about kind of, again, enjoying the playing and kind of the nuances of play. And today, again, the kids are, they're watching film and doing stuff that we never would have thought of in my day. So it was different.
Yeah.
And I'm thankful that, I had the opportunity to play when I could play, and my kids had a different experience. And I think they're thankful for their experience. So.
Yeah. Growing up for lacrosse for me, it was always, I would watch players that I would want to be like, and watch players that I said, oh, that guy's got a really nice shot. I want to go outside and do that in my backyard. So were there any kind of players that as you were growing up, you watched on TV and you said, I want to be like that guy, like that, that you wanted to model your game, whether it was football, basketball, baseball?
Oh, sure. We all had, boyhood heroes. And certainly growing up in this town, when I was a kid, there were 3 professional teams. So the Colts were the football team, and the Bullets were the NBA basketball team. And, of course, the Orioles were the Major League Baseball team. My favorite sport was baseball. Mm-hmm. So I was a big Orioles fan, and certainly one of my best friends growing up, and I had 2 very close friends in the neighborhood. One, was Coach Jordan. Coach Jordan and I have been friends since the early 60s. And another guy who actually, when I was kind of helping out being the football coach, joined us and for a couple of years as an assistant coach, Bobby Hopkins. And so the 3 of us would go out and play this game, the speedball, which was one-on-one baseballs. I know it sounds crazy, but you draw a box on the wall and you you pitch and back. And we would do the Orioles lineup, right? So, in my day, one time, and you try to imitate the players, right? You try to look like Brooks Robinson swinging, or you try to look like Paul Blair or Frank Rob, the guys who played in those days. And, and I kind of fancied myself a pitcher. Probably, again, my coaches would say I was more of a thrower, but, I tried to fancy myself a pitcher. And Jim Palmer was an idol of mine. I tried to imitate my windup. He was a lot more athletic, and it looked smoother when he did it than when I did it. But you had those stars. In football, I can remember Gale Sayers and Jim Brown. When I was a younger kid, when I got to be a little more knowledgeable, like a high school kid, running backs like Chuck Foreman. Probably, John Brockington. These are names you wouldn't know, but these were guys who played in the 70s. When I was really kind of into professional football. The Colts. Johnny Unitas was the Colt, right? There were a lot of great Colts, and the Colts went to the Super Bowl. I guess they went in '69. Tough year for Baltimore. I remember crying about this. The Colts lost to the Jets in a huge upset in the Super Bowl, and the Orioles lost to the Mets in the World Series, another huge upset because both the Orioles and the Colts were favored, and then the Bullets lost to the Knicks. It was one of the reasons, if you grow up here, you hate New York, but, if you're my age, it was a tough time. But
you were a diehard sports fan, Baltimore sports
fan.
Yeah,
I'm a Baltimore guy.
Yeah.
There's no doubt. And I've lived in other places, never very far from Baltimore in my heart of hearts. So, so I probably, I'm thinking when I was a kid, following the Baltimore guys closely, but they were, national games. So, you watch the Knicks in basketball, or you watch the Yankees, or, you watch the LA Rams or whoever it was. So, I certainly knew players then. I don't know any players today. Mm-hmm. If you ask me who's the best running back in the NFL, I don't have a clue. So now, if you ask me who the best running back in the NFL is in 1968, I probably have a better idea.
So you're not a Ravens big time fan today, or?
Sure. I pull for the Ravens. I'm a Baltimore guy, so I pull for the Ravens.
Do you watch all the games and everything?
Sometimes. I probably, again, for people who know me, when the games are on, that means the golf courses are relatively empty, so it's a great time to go out and play golf.
True.
And I would rather do that, but than watch the games. But I watch some, but I don't follow it the way I did when I was 15 years old. I really don't know. I know who Lamar Jackson is. I know who Mark Ingram is. I know some names, but I couldn't really tell you.
But you're not sitting on the couch for 4 hours on a Sunday watching the Ravens, yeah.
No, and that may be, as we talked earlier, that may be a function of I didn't do that when I was a kid, right? So it's just I like being outside and kind of being active. I'm thankful for relatively good health in my more senior years now. So, if I can go out and play golf, which is the thing I do now because I can't play any of the other games anymore, I'm going to go do that. I mean, I'd rather be active and outside than than kind of sitting on the couch watching the game. But if there's nothing else to do and it's late at night, I don't mind watching. But I'm not as enamored with it as I was as a young guy.
I'm totally with you. I've never been kind of a sitting on the couch watching NFL guy. Like I'll follow a little bit, and when my friends are watching, I'll check it out. But I'm like you. I'd rather be outside doing things.
Yeah, I just even as much as I love golf as an adult. I mean, the Masters was on last week. I played. I can watch the highlights. I'd rather be out there, enjoying the play.
Did you golf much when you were at Gilman or in college, or is this something you picked up recently?
Picked up as an adult. And my father, who learned as an adult as well, we actually started playing kind of through the same process. He didn't play as a kid. I mean, some of that was golf was expensive, but it also wasn't very accessible to African American people. So my dad started playing in the Army. He had been in the Army. He had ROTC at Morgan State and went in the Army, and I guess his commanding officer was a golfer, was a white man, and said, hey, you're going to, the military has a way of saying, you're going to join me and you're going to enjoy it, right? Mm-hmm. So he learned to play golf because his commanding officer played, and they played together. And then he loved it, and he bought me a set of clubs when I was probably 10 or 11 years old, and I didn't take to it. But when I was in the Navy, I was getting out, actually, coming on my way back to Gilman, but I had like 3 or 4 months where I wasn't assigned to a ship anymore, and we were just kind of waiting to be processed. I had a guy who was also there, who was a golfer. He said, hey, let's go to the driving range and try it. Man, I don't play that. I don't play golf. I mean, And I was young then. I was still kind of active doing other stuff. You'll try. Well, I went to the driving range and completely fell in love with it. I remember
First time.
Wow. Well, first time as an adult. I literally left the driving range, drove to Kmart, bought a starter set, a bag, and balls. I came home and my wife goes, "What is all this?" I said, I just love golf, and so I've been addicted ever since. So I enjoy it. Again, I'm not great at it, but I just enjoy being out there and kind of chasing the ball around. I don't find it as much as I'd like to, but I do enjoy being out there.
Yeah, I played a little yesterday. My game is I think I just need to do what you did and spend hours just hitting the ball at the driving range before I really go out.
Well, yeah, the downside to golf, particularly as an adult with responsibilities, is it's very time consuming. And so, I'm sure, and of course, my wife and children aren't here, but, I played at times where I probably shouldn't have been. I put a lot of time into it because I just enjoyed it so much. Now that my kids are grown and, the wife has her job, I have my job, so I have more time to do it. But you have to put the time in order to be somewhat proficient. And even then, it's the hardest game I ever tried to play. So,
it is.
It's a difficult game.
Did you do many lessons, or did you kind of just learn on your own?
No, I took some lessons part of that, once I went to Kmart when I was a young sailor, I got lessons from the pro at the Navy golf course there in Norfolk, Virginia. And then when I got here, there's a guy, some of the local people would know, a guy named Jay Perkins, who's giving me some lessons. He's a terrific teacher, actually runs a driving range out on Bel Air Road. He's given me some lessons. So, I've taken some lessons. I read a lot about golf. Mm-hmm. I love reading about golf. I've read golf biographies. I, read lessons. I mean, I just, I'm totally involved with it. A person could have a lot of vices. If golf's the worst one, then,
you're doing pretty well.
Well, it might keep you out of trouble.
Yeah. Do you think golf, I was thinking about this because I've played a lot of tennis over quarantine just during the summer. It's the best social distancing sport for me. Played a little golf, but mostly tennis. Do you think golf's the most mentally challenging sport you've ever picked up?
Yes. I think it requires a personal discipline, mental discipline, and emotional discipline. There's a physicality to it too, especially if you're walking, which I like to do. But it's such a, again, the skills in golf are so refined. The margin of error is so small. I like to say it's the equivalent in basketball of, you've been fouled going up for a shot and you've got 2 shots and, you go to the line, the first one you make, and the second one you throw it over the backboard. I mean, no one does that in basketball. I mean, you certainly miss shots, but you don't throw it over the backboard. But literally in golf, the margin of error is so small that you can hit a great shot and then swing and miss. I mean, so because it requires such minute skills and proficiency. So it's a hard, and I think that's the joy of it, right? I mean, I think
it's the addiction of it. Maybe.
It's the addiction, because you always think, particularly if you hit a good one, that you can hit a good one every time.
It feels so good.
It feels great, and then of course, the frustration is that why can't I do that? I mean, my dear friend Dan Christian has a line, just once I wish I could play my usual game. That's and that's true about golf. Just one time, I'd love to do it, but I don't care who you are, even the best golfer. I mean, Dustin Johnson had this wonderful tournament in the Masters. He was 20 under, but I bet he won, and he's very satisfied with that. But he was thinking, if I had done this, that, or the other, I would have been 22 under or 23. I mean, it's just that kind of game. It can never be conquered. It can only be played, right? So so it has that wonderful quality to it.
Keeps you coming back.
Always.
So Timmy, when you first came to Gilman, who were some of the major figures here who kind of inspired you or led you into, whether it was to focus on athletics or academics, or who were the kind of the staple figures at Gilman during your time in high school?
Yeah, I was again pretty fortunate to have, first of all, I'm a Finney era guy, right? So Mr. Finney was Gilman for those of us from that time, and his son Stuart was in my class, so that even made Mr. Finney kind of a class dad as well as being the headmaster. And in those days, he taught a ninth grade religion class, so we all had him in class. He also was, even though he was the headmaster, he was the JV football line coach under another dear friend and mentor of mine, Mr. Bristow. So he was Gilman. And then, of course, along the way, all my coaches, I mentioned Mr. Bristow, who's been a wonderful friend and mentor. Kind of literally, I followed in his footsteps almost to the letter. There was Dr. Neal, who was a history teacher of mine, a baseball coach, assistant baseball coach, pitching coach, which made certainly that his hands were full kind of dealing with me. So we got, and we're still friends today. I had Mr. Kazumbo was the head baseball coach. Mr. Bristow was also the head basketball coach. I played for him. There were Mr. Sotir. The stadiums and everything. He was my football coach, and obviously a huge mentor in my life. I think he was probably the guy. If I had to point to a guy who gave me the opportunity to do something that allowed me some access to colleges for which I would have never had access, he was the guy that put me in a position to try to show well. He was a wonderful mentor, and I'm going to leave people out because there are just so many names. If I think about people from back in those days, and a lot of those people were still around when I became a young teacher. So I graduated from Gilman in 1977, and then went off to college, and then went in the Navy, and so I came back and joined the faculty in 1985. So it hadn't been that long. It had been an 8-year gap, but some of the people who were still here, Mr. Neal, now Dr. Neal was here, Mr. Bristow was here, Mr. DeMule was here, Mr. Schmick was here. All these people, the middle school guys, Mr. Abrams, Mr. Smith, who, funny, we worked together in athletics. And there were so many people who were still here when I became a teacher. And it was a great opportunity for me, because I remember them certainly as a student, and so you know them when you're a boy. But then when you become a man, and you develop friendships with those guys, Mr. Schloter, Mr. Vicio, and again, Mr. Green, who was the first African-American teacher here and a beacon for a lot of the black kids. And I didn't really appreciate him as much as a student because I didn't have any direct contact with him. But when I became a teacher, I remember he called me in his office early on, and he kind of read me the riot act. Look, you better get your act together. You represent more than yourself here. And, so there was so many great mentors and teachers, and again, when you ask me to name people, I'm always afraid I'm going to leave people out. But
Right.
I just, Gilman was very formative for me, and clearly, I like to tell people sometimes I'm like Peter Pan, right? Because I'm literally at the same place at the age of 61 that I was at the age of 11. So I haven't come very far.
But there's something about Gilman that made you want to come back.
Yeah, well, I thrived here,
Yeah.
and it was a place for me that was comforting, and it wasn't without problems. I mean, we've had a lot of talk recently about social injustice, and like everybody, I had incidences that were unpleasant. But my overall view of the school, and certainly because I came back, was that it was a very positive influence on my life. I mean, a formative influence. Probably, obviously I have my family and my parents, and now my wife and kids and friends and people who have been very important to me. But in terms of an institution forming kind of who I am, I mean, Gilman is that place. I mean, I'm proud of the college I went to, and the elementary school, and those things. And proud of my service, but in the military. But Gilman was the place, I think, that where I grew up a lot and learned a lot, and some of the values that I learned at Gilman are still values that I treasure and try to pass on to future Gilman guys. All the kids who've been tolerant enough to hang out with me in a classroom or on a field or in a gym, or all the different places where you get to hang out with kids if you happen to be a teacher and a coach.
Yeah, it really is an amazing place. When you went off to college, what was that process like in your leaving Gilman, going off to Penn, and how you really discovered maybe what you were into at Penn and playing sports there, and studying English, right? What was that experience like at Penn?
Well, it's funny, very different than kids today. I think in those days, you kind of went where you wanted to go or they wanted you. And in my case, I applied to schools where I'd been recruited. And again, I came out of nowhere because my junior year at Gilman, I was not a known athlete except for maybe a couple of people around Gilman. And then my senior year, just because of a bunch of different circumstances, graduations, injuries, and that kind of thing, I got an opportunity to kind of be in the spotlight on a really good team. And people thought maybe that I might be able to play, beyond Gilman. And so I was recruited by the Ivies and the academies, that level. Not really, well, in those days, you didn't have, whatever, Power Five, conferences. I wasn't that level an athlete. Maryland wasn't really interested. I wasn't good enough or big enough or fast enough or whatever they thought. And so, I was kind of that mid-range, I guess, kind of guy. And so, and Gilman in those days sent a lot of kids to the Ivy League. And so, and that was a big deal for my parents, because my parents, had gone to historically black colleges in the 50s. And, the Ivy League was not accessible to them. And I think they felt that was an important thing for the next generation to have access. And so I applied to a bunch of Ivies, and went to visit a couple, and felt that Penn, I liked the city of Philadelphia because it seemed to me it'd be a lot like Baltimore. I'll never forget the first time I walked into Franklin Field, and it was the first time I'd ever been on what was called AstroTurf in those days. This was Franklin Field's a huge place, and I'm daydreaming, like a cartoon, like, wow, they're yelling my name. I'm in the middle of the field. It never worked out that way. But I was just kind of smitten by the whole, the Penn aura. And of course, in those days, a lot of Gilman guys went to Princeton. And, Mr. Finney was a Princeton guy, and his son, my classmate, Stuart, went to Princeton. And I remember Mr. Finney, calling me in his office, and he said, "Are you sure about this Penn thing?" And I said, "Well, yeah, Mr. Finney, I think, Penn's a better fit for me." And so So I went up there, and they were going to also allow me to play baseball too, which was my first love. I mean, they recruited me as a football athlete, but the baseball people had interest, and I thank my baseball coach from Penn, a guy named Bob Seddon. He's retired now, living in Florida. He was a tremendous supporter of mine in my 4 years there, and of course, as fate would have it, I only played football at Penn. Well, in those days, you had to play freshman ball. You couldn't play varsity. So I played on the freshman team and was so-so. I think I loved playing Gilman football, but I didn't really love football,
Mm-hmm.
And so, when you go to college, as you know, Jake, because you were a legitimate Division I athlete, that's hard work. If you're going to play college, anything, you got to love it. And I didn't have the love for football that I had for baseball. So I ended up playing 4 years of baseball. My sophomore year, first year on the varsity for football, I went through camp.
Summer camp.
That's
got to be.
And did it. We had 3-a-days in those days.
Yeah.
Went through camp because I wanted to give it a shot, and decided at the end of camp, my roommate, who's still a dear friend, he was a good football player. He played 4 years at Penn. When I told him I was going to quit the football team, he's like, "What? Who finishes camp and then quits? Why would you do it now?" I said, "Well, I'd rather play fall baseball. I really don't want to play." So I stopped playing after camp my sophomore year and played baseball for 4 years. And again, I wasn't great at it. As a matter of fact, I had a pretty unstellar college career as a baseball player, but I loved to play. And if you're going to play in college, you got to love it.
You have to.
I really love baseball and very proud of having had the opportunity to play in college. I wish I had played a lot better, but that's okay. I'm a player. I like to play. I mean,
right.
It's one of another great quote from my dear friend Dan Christian. Dan Christian says, "You didn't sign up to win. You signed up to play."
Yeah.
And I love to play, so I was just happy playing. And I think very fondly back on those days, and still have some friends from those days. And I probably stay in touch more. Certainly working here, I stay in touch more with my Gilman friends than my Penn friends. But I still have some connections at Penn that I cherish. So it was a great experience to be a student athlete in college. It really was.
Yeah. Two sports is tough. I mean, it's a lot on your plate, especially with the summer camp for football. And
well, Jake, in those days, it wasn't as difficult as it is today. First of all, in the Ivy League, there was no spring ball, so there were a number of two-sport fall spring athletes in those days, and the out-of-season training was not what it is today.
It's not heavy lifting in the off-season.
I mean,
everything. Yeah.
I remember in football and in baseball, we did some off-season lifting, but it was not the same thing it is today. I mean, matter of fact, one of my teammates in college was our senior year. He was a classmate too. Was the captain of the football team and the baseball team, and handled that well. He was a real good player. But there was very little conflict. You didn't feel like if during baseball season you were missing anything for football, or even during football season if you were missing anything for baseball. Now we did have a little bit of a fall schedule in baseball. So if you were playing football, you couldn't participate in that. But you didn't really miss anything because a lot of guys were doing that.
Right.
There were a bunch of, in your sport, there were a bunch of football, lacrosse guys. Because I think in those days, lacrosse coaches really thought playing football would really help you as a lacrosse athlete. So it was pretty common in those days. I think today it's much more difficult, even at the D3 level where, it's more
same.
like it was in my day. But still, the D3 athletes work just as hard as the D1 athletes. So it's a commitment.
Yeah. I think what you said about absolutely loving your sport is so true. If you want to go play, even at the D3, D2, D1 for sure level in college, you have to be obsessed. I was obsessed with lacrosse, and I've always loved lacrosse. But when you're doing it for 6 hours a day, it's a different. You really have to think about, hey, this is my life now.
Well, and if you're doing it today, I mean, it's very likely. I have a daughter who is a Division II lacrosse athlete now, as a freshman in college. I mean, she's lifting in the morning or in the evening and on the weekends and practicing. I mean, it's playing the games that's fun, right?
Yeah, but that's only 12 days out of the year.
Right. I mean, the preparation to play is hard work. And let's not forget, because you are supposed to be a student athlete, although I would venture to say, nowadays, again, that athletic commitment almost makes you an athlete student. But you got to go to class. You have to stay eligible. I mean, hopefully you have to excel in the classroom because you're trying to find a life beyond sports, when you can't play anymore. I don't care how good you are. Even if you play at the highest level, at some point you're going to have to live and take care of yourself. And if you're a professional athlete, that's probably going to be, if you're great, it's going to be by the time you're 40. And if you're average, it's going to be by the time you're 30. So there's a life after playing. So you better try to excel in the classroom and figure out what you're going to do when your playing days are over.
Especially lacrosse. It's the day you graduate, really. I mean, you're not making $1 million playing lacrosse. So.
No, you're not. And I think, in a sport like lacrosse, and probably in the United States, beyond football, basketball, and again, baseball, college baseball, although there are more kids who jump from college baseball to MLB today, but that didn't happen in my day. Kind of in my day, if you weren't drafted out of high school, I mean, you probably were behind the 8 ball if you played in college. Now, that's not quite true today. But, beyond football and basketball, making a living as a professional athlete is it's a very narrow window.
Yeah.
And so, you better figure out what you're going to do with your life once your playing days are over.
Glad to hear you're a lacrosse dad. You
there's
transitioned a little bit.
There's some real irony there. Actually, my oldest daughter, so we have 3 girls. The oldest daughter played some lacrosse in high school, so that was my first foray into the whole lacrosse dad thing. Thankfully, my middle daughter played 4 years of softball at RPCS, so I did have one child kind of follow my footsteps. And the youngest one, she's of the 3, she's the only one who's playing in college or played in college, and she was 3-sport. We believed in that. We didn't let her do the club lacrosse exclusive kind of thing. She played soccer in the fall and played basketball in the winter and lacrosse in the spring. So, we wanted her to be well-rounded, and I think she is. But, she was probably a little more gifted in lacrosse, and so she has the opportunity to play now. And we'll see how that, again, she's kind of like I went through it, right? I mean, she's a freshman now, and it's a lot of work, and hopefully she'll stay with it, but she might not. I mean, and again, she's there to go to school and to get a degree and have a life. So, however she feels is the best way to do that, and we're behind her 1,000%.
Absolutely, yeah. Even in the summertime or on breaks, it's like when I was on winter break in college, the whole time you're supposed to be home enjoying the holidays, with their family. You get a nice month off.
Right.
The whole time I was thinking about the run test. Am I going to pass this run test when I get back? Well,
and my youngest is dealing with that now. I mean, they had practice right up to the time she came home for Thanksgiving, and she's got to work out, right? Yep. She doesn't have to be back in school until I think January 19th, and the COVID thing makes everything so uncertain at this point. But I mean, there's an expectation when she returns. They're in season then. I mean, you assuming that people will be playing then. I mean, she's got to hit the practices and the games running, right? I mean, you got to be ready.
You have to be ready.
You can't play yourself into shape anymore, which in my day you probably could do that a little bit, but not anymore. You better be ready when you get there, or else you're going to get left behind.
Were you introduced to lacrosse at all growing up, or was it always baseball was your first love of a sport? And
well, in all honesty, Jake, in Baltimore, lacrosse when I was a kid was a fairly segregated sport. Racially, and I don't mean that there was a law or a rule, but I grew up 10 minutes from Gilman. I'd never heard of lacrosse. I mean, there were pretty much, it was a private school white game. Now, having said that, and I didn't know a lot about it, but Morgan State actually had a men's team, and there was one guy in our neighborhood who played lacrosse at Morgan State. But it was not the game to play, in the black neighborhoods. And in Baltimore in those days was pretty segregated. So there weren't, in my memory, I don't remember a lot of integrated neighborhoods. So kind of where you grew up is what you played. So in my neighborhood, that was football, basketball, and baseball. No one played lacrosse, or very few guys that I knew of played lacrosse. So I really didn't know anything about it until I got to Gilman. And I saw these guys running around with these sticks, and I had no idea what they were doing. And I had no interest because I was a baseball guy.
Yeah.
I probably, had I been your age or younger, maybe things would be different because baseball is probably in the city is not as popular today as it was when I was a kid. But baseball was my game.
Yep.
And I had friends like Coach Jordan and Bobby Hopkins, guys I grew up with, they end up kind of being track guys, some of them. I was really into baseball, so that was my thing. So I just stuck with baseball. Is what I loved.
You weren't going to be swayed any way
No,
from baseball.
I didn't.
That was,
I was a baseball guy.
Yeah.
I mean, if lacrosse had been maybe in the fall and the choice had been football or lacrosse, maybe I'd have been swayed, although I don't think my dad would have let me because he was a football guy.
Yeah.
But no, I had no interest. But I mean, I watched the game and sort of had friends on the lacrosse team, and when I was here, they were very good. I mean, I think my junior year, they were ranked. You didn't rank in those days, but they were considered to be one of the top teams in the country, high school teams in the country. They were very, very good. And the lacrosse coach was a wonderful guy, is a wonderful guy named Dave Allen. He's another one of those.
Love Dave Allen.
He's another one of those mentors from my youth. And he was, he had fabulous teams. And, I mean, it's a funny little side story with Coach Allen. And he doesn't remember this, because, I understand now, having taught a long time, you don't remember all these things that kids remember. But maybe he, if someone's to blame for me being kind of still hanging around here. So when I was in the 10th grade, I'll never forget, I saw him outside of what is now kind of the Lumen Center, but then was the Cottage. And that's where the kind of language arts guys, the modern language guys hung out. And I saw him, I said, Mr. Allen, because there was no coach, and everybody was Mr., right? So, Mr. Allen, what do I have to do to teach at Gilman? And again, I was in the 10th grade.
You asked him that.
I asked him that. And he said, well, first you have to graduate from Gilman, which was not guaranteed, right? And I wasn't the strongest student. But and he said, and then you go to college and you graduate and you can come back. Okay. And it was probably a 10-second conversation. And he was just humoring a little kid who was, asking the question, but I never forgot that.
That's amazing that you asked that question.
Yeah, I was the son of two teachers, so maybe that was part of it. My mom's parents were teachers, so it's kind of the family business a little bit.
Yep.
Now I'm the only teacher in my generation. My brothers don't do that, but I kind of felt that was where I was headed eventually. So I don't know.
That's awesome.
It was a crazy off the cuff thing, but I didn't forget it. It's not I was focused on I'm doing everything to come back to Gilman to teach, but it was certainly
it's floating around.
It was floating around in there even as a young kid.
So I definitely want to talk about English and how you got into English, and then ROTC, and then the Navy. But before that, when you got out of the Navy, what was it that you said in your brain that you were like, I want to go teach at Gilman?
Well, so it was a little odd. I was supposed to be released from I had knee surgery. I'd hurt my knee in college and then kind of exacerbated in the Navy. So I had knee surgery, which took me prematurely off the ship. I was attached to an LST out of Norfolk, Virginia, gone overseas, made a med cruise. And when I came back, went to see the doctor, and they said I needed surgery. I had torn my ACL. And so I got the surgery and thought that I was going to be medically discharged early, which would have been the fall of '84. And they decided I was fit for duty, which I probably could have been fit for. I was fit for duty. I could have gone back on a ship and done that. But at that point, my service path had kind of been disconnected from the traditional path of guys, moving up in the ranks. And I had a year left on my obligated service. And so I decided that I wasn't going to take I'd gone to what was called limited duty, and I actually worked for the Naval Hospital lawyer, and when I was in the Navy, kind of recuperating from my surgery. So I decided I wasn't going to go back to a ship, that I was going to get out at the end. And that's when I seriously thought about what to do after the Navy, and thought about law school a little bit, because that had crossed my mind. But eventually, and I don't remember the details, but I was on the phone with Mr. Finney, and he was always a big advocate of mine, and said, Timmy, we'd love to have you come back and teach. And I was like, oh, Mr. Finney, I would love that. And so they offered me a contract in the fall. For the fall of '84. And again, Mr. Neal at that time was the upper school head, so he was also an advocate of mine. And so they saved the spot for me, but Uncle Sam didn't let me go until April of '85. So, which I think rankled some feathers, because I had a job, but I wasn't, and Gilman wasn't paying me, but there was a slot reserved for me, even though I wasn't here. But Mr. Neal and Mr. Finney reserved that spot for me. So I actually arrived in April, early April. That's when the Navy finally let me go, because they were going to hold on to me to see if I would change my mind. Because after May of '85, my service time was up. They couldn't hold me unless there was a war, and then they activated everybody. But they couldn't hold me. So when I said, no, I'm leaving, they just said, okay, fine, we'll let you go. And so I was gone the 1st of April. So I never forget this. I was married by that point, and we lived in a little furnished apartment in Virginia Beach. We packed the U-Haul with the stuff we had, and I got out on a Friday. I got my discharge papers on a Friday. I was at Gilman on Monday, and I started, I started at Gilman in that early April. And they didn't, again, I couldn't teach a class at that point because it was April. So in those days, the seniors were prefects, and they monitored study hall. So I think they thought it would be a great idea. My baby brother was a senior. They thought it'd be a great idea to put us together, Holley and Holley together in this study hall. And that didn't work well. my brother wasn't going to look at me, one, as Mr. Holley. So,
right.
And two,
as a senior especially.
Yeah, he was a senior. And I had been away, but I'd been in the service. So I was a little rigid in the way I looked at the world. And so there was a little clash there. So it was kind of humorous as I look back on it, but it wasn't a great match. But I was an assistant JV baseball coach that spring under a wonderful guy, Doug Lewis, who's, same age as I am. And now Doug has been teaching for years up at St. George's School in Newport, Rhode Island, or Middletown, Rhode Island. Anyway, so I was with Doug, and we had a great time with that. And then the following fall, I was full-time kind of teaching classes and all that stuff. So, Mr. Finney and Mr. Neal, those two in particular, probably, and I'm guessing Mr. Green was helpful behind the scenes too, to kind of make sure. And at that time, there were a lot of Gilman alumni on the faculty, but there'd never been an African-American alumnus on the faculty. So my arrival made the first guy, which said something for the school. I mean, it had been, so that's the spring of '85, the first Black student, I think, was on campus in '63, first Black graduate, '68. So it took a little while to get a Black faculty member who had gone to the school, but, Gilman was trying, to broaden horizons. And I think, when I was a student, so Mr. Green was here, and Mr. Smith, who was Mr. Green's assistant, and actually my senior year was the head baseball coach. They were the only African-American upper school people. I think there was a guy in the middle school named Mr. Dill, who unfortunately passed away, and there was a couple other guys, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Small. I mean, those names ring a bell, from my childhood. But there weren't, a lot of African-American faculty for African-American students with whom to connect. And that's, that I kind of upon reflection now, that was a challenge. And I think the kids today have more options, because you're not going to get along with everybody, and you're not going to buy into everybody.
Right.
And Mr. Finney was a huge proponent of integration and embracing your fellow person, whoever that person is. And so he was trying very hard, I think, to broaden Gilman's scope. And so when I got here, I think part of Mr. Green's mentoring to me was, again, it was, my presence was bigger than just, hey, you're some former student who's coming in here for, there were responsibilities and things that were important to realize if you were going to kind of do this job well and be a positive factor in the school.
That is really important. Just a question about Mr. Finney. When he was doing this, when he was trying to integrate Gilman and broaden the horizons of the school, was he getting much pushback during that time from faculty?
Again, I was a student, so I couldn't answer that specifically. And he wasn't alone. I mean, there were a lot of people, faculty and administrators and trustees and parents, and there were a lot of people who were supportive of what he was doing. But yes, there were certainly people who didn't think it was the right move for the school. He gets, I think, the lion's share of the credit because he was the leader. So he had to take the blows, just like Mr. Smythe has to take the blows today. I mean, there are a lot of people involved, But when you're the heavy is the head that wears the crown, right? So when you're the guy out front, you get some credit, but you also get a lot of grief. And so yeah, I know he took some grief, but he was such a man of principle that I think, and I'm not saying he was impervious to any pain or hurt, but I think he thought what he was doing was right, and he was not going to be moved.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. So those figures that were here that influenced you, Green, Finney, Bristow, you really had relationships with them as a student, and like continued those relationships into your first years as a faculty member.
Oh,
they really, and that's one of the things I love about, I didn't know Mr. Finney, but just hearing about him and his legacy, that he made connections with all of the students, and he knew everyone.
Yeah, he would actually look at pictures and memorize names. I've always been fascinated that he could do that because he knew guys' names. And the other fascinating thing about him was he still knew your name 20 years, 30 years after graduation. Now, for someone like me who's still here, that's, maybe a little easier. But for the guy he hadn't seen in 25 years, he would say, "Hey, so-and-so, how you doing? How's," he was miraculous in the way he could do that. But yeah, I think in those days, and the school was a little smaller, so it was probably easier. But you knew these faculty members in all aspects of what you did, because Gilman was so committed to the teacher coach that invariably you saw those people as teachers, so academicians, coaches, so athletically, mentors, if they were your advisor, or even, they had other influences on you. So you had real relationships with them, and they were, and again, I was a challenging kind of guy. So, they were patient with pretty rambunctious boys. And, boys, particularly adolescent boys, can be full of a lot of vim and vigor. But because Gilman was focused on boys, I think there was a calling for those faculty members to really meet the boys where they were. Mm-hmm. Now that we had to conform. I mean, it was a school, and there were rules and regulations, and but I think there was a real consistency on the faculty of understanding boys and how boys thought, and we weren't all the same. Some were a little easier to deal with than others. I would put myself in the difficult spot, but those guys, they stood with you. I mean, they really wanted you to succeed. I mean, they, and again, I'm sure I was a student, so I don't remember. I'm sure that there are a lot of guys from those days. I mean, Gilman was a challenging place, and so it was not an easy place for a lot of guys. And there are some alumni who don't have fond memories of it, right? And maybe didn't connect with a teacher, or maybe even, had a bad relationship with teachers or coaches. I mean, I recognize that happened. My own personal experience, that was not my experience, but I know it was an experience for some, and I know some personally who don't have fond memories of their Gilman experience. But for me, I just, and I'm sure that's why I came back. It was such a great place for me to grow up and to try to learn how to be a man and learn how to do good. And the lessons I learned, as I said earlier, I try to live them, and that's important. I try, right? I mean, because we all sin and fall short. Exactly. As the good book says. So, there's a lot of, you live long enough, you're going to fall down a lot. And I think one of the things I learned at Gilman, and my parents are this way too, is you got to get back up, right? And that's not always easy, and some people don't get back up, but, you're going to fail. It's not the end of the world. Just, try to be better tomorrow. And I think that's try to instill that in my own kids, and try to live that way myself.
Of course. And I think that's something that sports, teaches. Gilman for sure, but the sports and the athletic piece to Gilman, that's something that's influenced me to live in that type of way, is like failing in sports and messing up on the field. It's like, you have to have a short memory. You have the next play.
Right. And even when things are not going your way, and you're pretty sure they're not going to go your way, I think probably for the kids who maybe were, and I said this a lot when because we lost a lot, but for the kids who were on the varsity football team the 2 years I was the head coach, I would be yelling, "Keep playing!" we could be down 40. Keep playing,
Yeah.
And again, that line from Dan rings in my head. You signed up to play. Keep playing.
Yeah.
You want to win because we have scoreboards. We keep score, right? But that's really not why you're playing, or at least I don't think it's why you're playing.
Mm-hmm.
You're playing for the joy, what you can learn from it, the process. That's why you play, right? And so the notion that if you made a bad play, and I struggled with this as a student, as a kid. I would linger about mistakes as an athlete, and it probably, unfortunately, affected me negatively. So one of the, the old line sometimes, those who can't do teach. I'm not sure that's necessarily true, but I think I was a better coach than I was a player. And one of the things that I brought into coaching was that, because I had experienced it as a player, was to try not to let kids linger on their mistakes. Because ultimately, the great players, and back in the day, there was a Michael Jordan commercial, and this is probably when he was still playing, so it's a long time ago, that talked about all the misses he had,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we remember him for all the great plays, and that's true for any athlete. But you're gonna make mistakes in life and on the athletic field. And so, like you said, the thing you learn from that is, okay, I messed up. Own it, admit it, try to learn from it, and be better the next play.
Mm-hmm.
Until you don't play anymore, right?
Right.
And at that point, the good Lord's called you home, and the game's over anyway.
Taking that into your coaching and into your golf game too, right?
Oh yeah, well, in golf, and again, and it's been a process. I'm still learning, right? We're all prone to digress and to linger on past mistakes, and it's, again, probably in my history, I've done that more than most. So I'm really working hard at trying to live up to, again, always falling a little short, but trying to live up to the mantra. Okay, you made a mistake. If you're using golf as a metaphor, okay, you hit the ball out of bounds. All right, hit another ball,
Mm-hmm.
make a better shot, because that's how you got to play the game.
Well, that's an important point too about coaching, because I think a lot of people think if you're a really good athlete or really good player, that automatically makes you a good coach, but that's just not true at all. Even, that because you might have dwelled a little bit more on your mistakes as an athlete, and now as a coach, you can relay those important lessons to players. So
yeah, I think one of the things that coaching affords you the objectivity in some cases, although coaches get caught up in the emotion as well. But particularly if you've been a player and then a coach, you have a little bit of experience to know how to deal with things, and you know how that player feels. And I think, when you're an athlete going through it, you tend to just kind of be in the moment and, trying to be a better athlete. When you're a coach, you're responsible for people more than just you, right? So if the coach is moping around, and by the way, I've been a mopey coach from time to time, so it's not like I'm immune from that. But if the coach is moping around, that's affecting everybody. If the player is moping around, that might affect others because he's a teammate. But the player is in his own way. As a coach, you have, and I learned this in the military too, you have a larger responsibility. It's not about you. It's about, now you're a factor, but other people are involved. And so you don't have time to kind of, at least not in front of your players. What you do at home or in the shower or wherever
Right.
you're lamenting the mistakes you made, that's something that you deal with personally. But in terms of leadership, if you're out in front, you got to convince them to follow you.
Mm-hmm.
And generally, they're not going to follow a person who is negative or who is, downtrodden or those kind of things. And again, I've been there, done that. I've tried to, I'm kind of retired from that whole world now. But when I was doing it, I tried to be as positive as I could be and encourage the players to continue to look up and forward.
And timing too. So knowing when to lay into your players, and then knowing when to step back and kind of, be positive about things and look at some of the good things that you're doing out there. Like that timing, I feel like, just from observing the coaches I've been around here at Gilman and in college, when you position yourself and spin things more positively versus when it's time to say, look, like this you guys are doing these things wrong and this needs work, right? That timing, I feel, is crucial to coaching.
Yeah, I think, and as a coach, I probably erred more on being kind of the Father Flanagan guy. If there was a good cop, bad cop on a coaching staff I was generally going to take the good cop role.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I couldn't get excited and kind of, jump on a team or somebody for making a mistake, but for the most part, I was the encouraging one, and that's great. But you also need people who hold people accountable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I tried to make sure I had people around me who were going to be doing that a little easier than I might do it, and because it's important. At times I've been a head coach, and when I was as an assistant, there are roles that everybody plays. Sometimes kids think, well, that guy is this way, or that, as coaches, that coach is this way, this coach is that way. Well, and this was true when I was in the service too, you're playing a role,
mm-hmm.
right? If sometimes the hard guy, assistant coach, has to be that way because the head coach is a softie, and sometimes it's the other way around. The head coach is a tyrant, and so you got to have the consoling assistant coaches. So everybody kind of plays their role, and so I think you're right. The timing is crucial. You kind of have to have a feel for what kids are going through, and certainly having been a player, that helps with that. But I do think part of that comes with a lot of, even if you don't have all the playing experience, it just comes with experience of being around players in those scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
And it translates sports. It's not, the kid who misses a field goal, in a game is no different than a kid who misses a free throw in a game, and no different than a kid who strikes out. Whatever, or the goalie in lacrosse or soccer who lets in the goal. Those are all very similar circumstances.
Right.
And what you learn over time is how to handle players when they go through that. And some players need an arm around the shoulder, and some players need a kick in the pants.
Mm-hmm.
And some players need different things at different times. Right. So there's no substitute for experience and just dealing with all those different situations.
And knowing your players too. We talked about it with Huback too. And he talked about, Rob Huback on the last podcast episode, he talked about how sports have influenced his position now in the upper school as a head. And he talked about knowing your players and the personalities, and when to have this conversation with somebody based on how they might react versus maybe be a little bit more positive with this personality. And that's right. That's all through sports.
And I'll tell you, having taught English for a long time, one of the great things about the teacher-coach model, which Gilman holds dear, is that, again, that's another lens through which you get to learn kids, and they get to learn you. I remember coaching a kid in basketball one time, and we were going through a concept, and he was struggling with it. I'd had him in English in 9th grade, and I said to him, "You're just like Brutus, in the play Julius Caesar." And he was like, "Brutus? Yeah, he has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Go do." Oh, okay, got it. Excuse me, it wasn't Brutus, it was Cassius. Apologize for the English laureates out there. Yes, Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. I think that's right. Anyway, I messed up the story, but the point was that kid, because I had him in English class and kind of knew him from that experience, it helped.
He gets the analogy.
The analogy worked in basketball in that particular circumstance.
I love that.
It's been a long time since I taught Julius Caesar, so I hope I don't know if I remember that correctly or not, but close enough at this point.
Right. That's amazing, though. That's great, being able to use that teacher-coach model in sports and relate.
Well, I think that was, again, as I mentioned earlier, that's one of the nice things about Gilman when I was a kid here, that the teachers were Mr. or Mrs. or whatever their title was, doctor. Mm-hmm. I didn't call a coach until I got to college. Mm-hmm. And actually in college, they wanted to be called coach because that was the moniker for their profession.
Right.
But at Gilman, my football coach was Mr. Sotir.
Yep.
He was not Coach Sotir. Not call him Coach Sotir now, or Coach Bristow, or Coach Kazumbo, or all these guys who coached me. But that's not what we called guys.
What did Mr. Sotir teach here at Gilman?
So he had been a phys ed major. He'd gone to Springfield College, which is the top phys ed school in the nation, and had been a Navy pilot. So we had the Navy in common. He taught anthropology. He was the athletic director and the football coach, which was certainly a lot having tried it myself
Yeah.
for a couple of years. But he taught anthropology. Now, again, it's been a long time. He was not teaching when I was a student, but he taught after I left. When I was here, he was the athletic director and the head football coach. And I think he helped out a little bit in wrestling, helped out a little bit in lacrosse as well. But, he was and I think he was, Mr. Gamper, so Bill's father, had been the athletic director, and General Magruder had been an athletic director. I think in their day, that was more of a collateral duty. I think Mr. Sotir was maybe the first full-time AD. And you think about all the people who work in the athletic department now. So when Mr. Sotir was the AD, it was Mr. Sotir and a man named Mr. Harry, who was the kind of gym custodial guy, and Mrs. Bonnie Newton. There were 3 people over there. And then eventually they hired a couple other guys who came along a little bit later. But so he had his hands full.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. Well, now we have
manage.
15 people or whatever. I don't know. I mean, Mr. Rand and Mrs. Bristow would know that better, what the numbers are today.
Did you, so when you started teaching and coaching and doing all that, did you want to become an athletic director? Did you kind of fall into that role? And I know you spent some time at Haverford School.
I did, around the corner from Conestoga.
Yes, sir.
Your alma mater. I had not thought about being an athletic director at all.
Yeah.
Kind of fell into it. I was coaching and teaching, and Mr. Bristow was the AD, and toward the end of his tenure as AD, he named a couple of assistant ADs, and so I was one of them with Mr. Foreman and Mrs. Bristow. So I was an assistant AD at that time, and kind of my thing was scheduling, because I did it anyway as a basketball coach in the winter, so he just kind of let me do that. And then all of a sudden, this opportunity arose at Haverford School up in Philly, and I initially didn't want to go. But, my wife thought it was a good opportunity, and they, kind of made it worth my while. As in terms of salary, it was a jump from teacher coach to administrator. And so I went up there to try it out, and certainly was challenged. It was not an easy road for me. I missed Baltimore desperately. I tried to do a good job at Haverford School, and Coach Nostrand was there at the time. So I've known him since, 1994 is when I got there.
Was he already there?
He was there. He was a lower school teacher and the head lacrosse coach.
Oh, man.
So our paths crossed some. And, Coach Nostrand is a mellow older man now, but he was a fiery young coach in his youth at Haverford School. So, our paths crossed, and not always. I mean, we were friends, but we didn't always agree. So
he wanted those brand new uniforms. He wanted 4 different helmets.
Yeah, he wanted stuff that I couldn't give him, and so we clashed some. But it was positive. It was a good experience for me. And I'm not I don't handle conflict well just by my nature. But if you're going to do the job, you're going to have conflicts. So I got to know him. The other guy who with a Baltimore connection is Paul Bernstorff. So Paul Bernstorff just stepped down as the athletic director of St. Paul's after like 20 some years. And at the time he was the head football coach at Haverford School. So I, worked with him for a year and got to know him. So I've known those guys a long, long time. And, Bo Dixon had been the headmaster and had moved to McDonough. And the guy who was the athletic director at Haverford School before I got there was a guy named Jack McMullen, who also ended up at McDonough as the athletic director. So I knew those guys. And I, as much as Philadelphia is kind of like Baltimore, it's not Baltimore.
It's
right?
not.
And so, I actually felt a little out of place. And I was told a funny story by 2 kids. They're Harvard kids, actually. One was a Haverford School kid, and the other one was a Gilman kid. And I was AD at Haverford for 3 years and came back to Gilman when Mr. Bristow stepped down to be the Gilman AD. And the 2 kids were up there and they run into each other. I think they were both lacrosse athletes. And the Gilman kid says to the Haverford kid, hey, Mr. Holley's coming back to Gilman. He's leaving Haverford School and coming back to Gilman. And the Haverford School kid apparently said something like, well, I'm not so sure he ever actually left Gilman in the first place. Right?
Yeah, his heart was
there. I tried to be as much a Haverford School guy as I could be, but I guess, you can see it on my sleeve. I'm a Gilman guy. So so I was very pleased when Mr. Bristow called me, and actually Mr. Montgomery was the headmaster, and they both called to see if I was interested, and clearly I was. And so I came back to, after a three-year hiatus. Coach Wren was my advisee before I left. And so I missed, he was a sophomore when I went to Hafford, so I missed his last 2 years, and his classmates and great kids in that. I was close to those guys. And Coach Wren was a very good basketball player, so I was his basketball coach for the first 2 years. He was at Gilman in the upper school. And so I missed those guys, and I that was a sadness. But I think the move to Haverford professionally was a good one for me, and gave me the opportunity to kind of learn the ropes before I took the Gilman job. And I stayed in the Gilman job for 21 years, and it was I didn't really want to be an athletic director. I felt, and I remember Mr. Bristow and I have had this conversation. Mr. Bristow always told me he did what Mr. Finney told him to do, right? And I kind of felt the same way. I mean, I had Mr. Montgomery was the guy who hired me, as I mentioned before, and Mr. Bristow was always a mentor. So I kind of, and Mr. Finney was always there, right? I mean, he was always in the background. So I kind of felt like I was doing what those guys wanted me to do, not necessarily my own desire. I did what I,
sense of duty, maybe.
Well, yeah, try to help the school if they thought I was helpful.
Yep.
And I hope I was. I mean, I did it a long time and had tremendous help. And actually, so the two people running the athletic department now, I think that they're bringing the level up a lot higher, which is great for the school. So. But I hope I was helpful in the time I was there. I certainly was honored to do it. I mean, if you had told me when I went to Mr. Allen and said, "Hey, how can I teach at Gilman School?" and he would have said, "Well, one day you're going to be the Gilman athletic director for 21 years." Are you out of your mind? Come on, no, really. I just want a job, right? So I was pretty blessed to get the opportunity.
Awesome. And then how about your English, like your love for English? When did that kind of pick up and start? Was that in high school, or was that kind of when you went to Penn, or when did you start to love English?
So actually, I really started to love it when I started teaching. I chose English as a major because it was the easiest one for me.
Always a good writer and loved to read.
Well, I certainly fancied myself, good with words. I speak them a lot, certainly, but. Yeah. But I chose English because I, at least as an undergraduate, I did like to read some. I was not a good math science student.
Right.
My father and mother thought that it would be better for me since I was going to Penn to go to the Wharton School. I tried that for 2 semesters and they're like, "Oh no, this is not for me." I mean, macro and microeconomics were, might as well have been Greek.
Yeah. Just didn't stimulate me.
It didn't get me. So I became an English major. I could have been a history major too. That probably would have worked. But I chose English, and it did what you had to do to graduate, right? So again, I wasn't a stellar student. I just kind of did what I was supposed to do, and so because I was a ROTC guy, I ended up going to graduated from college at 1:00 in the afternoon, got commissioned at 5:00, and the next day I was off to my first duty station. So English was not in the picture anymore. I was a naval officer, and that was my job. So I did that for the 4 years I was supposed to do that, or 3 years and 10 months, whatever it was really, and came back to Gilman knowing I would teach and coach. Mm-hmm. Now again, I was not a stellar student. Mr. Bristow was my mentor, and I know he fondly remembers the time I'm sitting in the back of the classroom, and probably the same way I was, he taught me a couple times as a student. I'm sitting in the back of the classroom and he's teaching. I'm supposed to be learning from him and I'm kind of nodding, right? Because again, I wasn't as academically stimulated as I should have been. But I learned a lot from him and other, Mr. Daniels, Mr. Woodward, Mr. Downs. These were guys, who were mentors, older guys who had been teaching when I was a student, and then ran into all these wonderful Mr. Christian, Mr. Mason was there. I mean, guys who were more my contemporaries. I just learned and watched them. And what I found, interestingly, as an adult, that I couldn't put the pieces together. We all reach our points of knowledge at different times. But what I found as a teacher, when I actually read the books thoroughly and tried to understand them and tried to convey that interest to kids, that I enjoyed talking about books as much as I enjoyed playing sports. And I didn't necessarily love grading papers and that kind of thing because that's part of the mundane part of the job. But to sit down with kids, and the ninth, I taught all the grades. Actually, when I was at Harvard School, I even taught 8th grade. But to sit down with kids and talk about Atticus Finch and To Kill a Mockingbird, or Charles Darnay and Sidney Carton and A Tale of Two Cities. I mean, to do that for a living, whew, yeah. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed that. I mean, I love those books, and I love talking to ninth graders. Ninth graders are that wonderful age where they know a little bit, but they're still a little naive. Kind of get to 10th grade, they become cool because they know the ropes. But in ninth grade, they're still a little bit impressionable. And I always enjoyed teaching that stuff. And I probably, to get to back to your question, I tend to, as you know, go around in a lot of circles. I fell in love with English as a teacher. I mean, I really enjoyed teaching that stuff. And then I'd been at Gilman, I guess, 2 years, and because in those days, every English teacher had to come up with an elective because we were on a trimester basis. Mm-hmm. And when you got to the 11th grade, you had to take 3 Englishes, and then 12th grade, you took 3 more. So you needed a lot of elective choices. And we shared choices with Bryn Mawr and Roland Park. So I came up with a class that I'd actually had at Penn that was called Black Literature at Penn, and I called it 20th Century Afro-American Literature in those days. And so I started teaching that elective, and I taught that elective for 25 years. And thoroughly enjoyed that, teaching, seniors now. They were older and definitely the cool guys on campus, but still you're talking to kids with books.
Freshmen and seniors.
Yeah, I had freshmen. For a large part of my teaching life, I had mostly freshmen and seniors. I did the 10th and 11th grade at different times, but for the most part, consistently I had 9th graders and 12th graders, which is an interesting thing in the same day. But I really enjoyed kind of talking to kids about books and ideas and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm finding the same thing because you can't walk into class, if you're reading a book and not know everything about it. So when you're reading it, you're preparing for and these kids at Gilman are smart kids, yeah. Especially, if you're teaching seniors, they're going to ask you some questions. You better be ready to go. And by doing that process of really it's even maybe more intense of studying the readings and the materials than in college, where I'm just, writing a paper to submit it, or going to class to, get the grade, or, learn a little bit. I've always loved English too, but actually teaching something, I tell people this and they look at me like I'm crazy because, I've learned more from teaching than I have in school, which is amazing.
Well, and I think that's true in athletics as well. I mean, I think about, in football, I mean, I played on the defensive line. I was a nose guard. That's what they called them in those days, and then I was a running back for the large part of my high school experience. I was a running back, but I didn't know a lot of football. And then all of a sudden, you're coaching it, and I still don't know a lot, but I know more now than I certainly ever did as a player. And the same is true in the classroom. And look, one of the things too, and I learned this fortunately as a young guy, a young teacher, you got to be willing sometimes to be vulnerable, because even if you're well prepared, like you said, you're dealing with a lot of smart kids, someone's gonna ask you a question that you don't know. Mm-hmm. And kids they have great detectors, right? You can't buffalo them. You gotta, there's no problem with saying, hey, I've never thought of that, or I really don't know. Let me look it up. Or, I thought I saw this in the book, but maybe you're right. Those kind of, and I think that increases your relationship because there's a trust factor there that says, okay, I certainly never thought I was smarter than my students. I just thought I was older and a little more experienced, right? So once you acknowledge, and I think you acknowledge to them, hey, you guys are really, really smart, and I might not be as smart. But again, I've been around the block a little longer than you, so we can share ideas and share thoughts, and I think that'll be a good way to kind of carry out the class. I think it's important, because you can be very, 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 very well prepared, and somebody will come up with something that you're like, wow, I never thought of that.
Well, there's always in every class that someone will bring something up in class that I didn't notice when I read, and that's just the way it is. Yeah. Like if we all read the same book, you're going to read it differently than I would, yeah. And when we're sharing, I didn't notice that. Right. I didn't see that.
And even after years, I mean, Dan Christian and Sherman Bristow, when he's still here teaching English, we'd sit around and talk about A Tale or Two. He was a 9th grade English teacher, and Dan, we all taught it together. talk about ninth grade English in the books. We Tale of Two Cities, To Kill a Mockingbird, those books, Julius Caesar back in the old days. And then, of course, we switched to eighth grade, took Julius Caesar. And so I, for the most part, taught the Merchant of Venice after that. But we would talk about those books as if we'd never taught them before. I mean, we'd find something new. I mean, you could read that. I mean, literally after 20 years, you say, hey, did you realize that Atticus did this? And we'd never seen it before. I mean, that's one of the wonderful things about reading books. I'm not a scientist or a mathematician, and I'm sure those guys find new things as well. But that's always fascinated me. Is you think you know it inside and out, you've got all these notes in the margin, and then something pops up, and hey, I didn't know that. That's right.
Yep.
That kind of thing. It's really great.
Yeah, I think because you change every time you read it, and I actually look forward to that now. Teaching is like, I've read The Great Gatsby or whatever probably 15 times, but now in the spring when I teach it again, I'm looking forward to how it's different for me,
Well, and because you have different students, they see it through a different lens, it's, I know people sometimes think that teaching it can be monotonous and boring. I've never found it to be the case for me. I mean, working with kids in general, whether you're a parent or a teacher or a coach or whatever your role is, I mean, there's something new every day, and you make mistakes. So, you try to be better the next day. That's the goal.
Mr. Holley, it's been a pleasure, Tim, and to talk today. And we could probably sit here all. We're gonna have to have you on again because we only scratched the surface.
Well, Jake, what people will tell you again who know me is if you decide, hey, I gotta call Holley up and ask him a question, and I only have 2 minutes, don't call. Because that 2 minutes is going to turn into 90 minutes pretty quickly.
Well, this is the perfect form then. We can,
sit around and
send all your questions for Timmy Holley to me, and we'll cover them on the podcast.
We'll take hours and hours of listening to him drone on about, and with nonsense. So, but Jake, it's been a great honor to do it. I've enjoyed it, and thank you for not only this interaction between the two of us, but for doing it for the school, because I think this is a great way to kind of archive people at the school and what it means to be at Gilman, and for all of our great things and our warts. I mean, I think it's important because people on the inside know what's really going on, and the more you can chronicle that and have it out there for people to see, I think the better place will be. So thank you for your work. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming on.
All right, sir. Thank you.